It's the week ending Saturday the 8th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng U-turn on plans to scrap the 45p rate of income tax for higher earners, Elon Musk reportedly proceeding after all with his $44 billion buyout of Twitter, and music star Craig David claiming he is a super psychic clairvoyant. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from The Week magazine is Leif Arbuthnot from the refugee podcast Integrate That. It's Abdulwahab Tahhan. And back after a 3-year hiatus. It is king of conspiracy theories, news editor for The Week Online. How do those things go together? Jamie Timson.
Hello.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
For those who don't recall your time on the show or are new to us since then, you were known for bringing some pretty fringe stories to our attention. Is Stevie Wonder really blind was the classic.
That was a good one. The answer is yes to that, Ollie. Just
yes.
FYI. Yeah.
It was legitimately being speculated about. I presume, therefore, you've spent the last 3 years working for QAnon.
That's right, and I'm bringing it back to The Week Unwrapped. I thought, why not? No, I have. I think basically when I left you, Theresa May had just resigned, and we were about to get a new Prime Minister. And I went to the civil service, the Department for Transport, and basically was there for the entirety of that new Prime Minister's reign, I guess, Boris Johnson, and then left again. So I am probably to blame in some regards. But I was at the DFT, and I've just got a kind of just a short list of the things I was involved in. So there was obviously Brexit, and then there was the fuel crisis, so where everyone had to queue for petrol.
So were you involved in communications then?
Communications. I was in the press office.
Wow, so helping Grant Shapps to try and tell people why they couldn't travel during COVID, for example. Yeah.
I think my work was done, and I decided to come back to the week.co.uk after that, really. So yeah, it's been a bumpy ride.
Interesting. And let's see if you can bring some of that newfound establishment experience with you to your selection of stories. As I ask you, Jamie, what do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week we felt it might be best to remain poles apart.
This exit poll is right, Andrew. I will publicly eat my hat on your programme.
Have you got a hat?
No, but I'll get one, especially for the occasion.
Can I get the hat?
You can get the hat, providing it's made of marzipan.
I won't eat my hat, but I will eat my kilt if
I hope not. We're running out of hats
hat
here.
and the kilt.
Right. He's got more hats than he knows what to do.
That's a hat and the kilt. It may well be imprecise. Likely to be imprecise.
Likely to be imprecise.
Those are his words. I have them in quotations.
Paddy Ashdown, Alistair Campbell and Michael Gove talking to Andrew Neil on election night on the BBC back in 2015. So, Jamie, they were talking about polls then. What's the relevance now?
Well, so you might have noticed that the polls this week have shown that Labour have had the strongest polling performance for over 2 decades. Principally, it feels like by just not being the Tories, as far as I can tell. But the decision and like looking at this week in terms of polling and what story to bring to you guys, I think there was a very interesting discussion on Twitter during the Conservative leadership election about the effect that the polls had on kind of the coronation of Liz Truss, effectively.
Yeah, because she was massively ahead, wasn't she? 62% in one YouGov poll. But then when it came to the actual results, it was 57-43. Rishi Sunak had much more of a vote than people thought.
Yeah, and a lot of the discussion on Twitter was basically about if we didn't know about these polls, would it potentially have even been closer? Could we be currently sitting with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, which I have to say, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with a Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, but that's a little underreported, so we'll move away from that. But I think really it's about, I guess the question is whether or not polling is good for politics and opinion polls, and particularly in elections, what kind of effect they have on voter behaviour. I think there are obviously problems with polling at the moment. People aren't able to, even if you ask the pollsters, I think a lot of them would say that things like changing work patterns, different uses of phones, the kind of difficulty of reaching people who aren't interested in politics has meant that polling it's a lot harder to do. Voting intention is very difficult. And we do know from 2015, 2019, the referendum, they do get it wrong quite a lot of the time.
Yes, and that's what's quite interesting about this, I think, Leaf, is back in the day that Jamie was on the show regularly, post-Brexit, post-Trump, this conversation was something we were having a lot. Should we scrap polls? Should we ignore polls? They keep getting it wrong in really significant ways and undervaluing massive populist movements. And then somehow, over the last 3 or 4 years, people have forgotten that we were saying all that, and the polls get a lot of attention, front page news. Labour are going to win the next election by a landslide. Do you think we should ignore them more?
I think that, yes, we probably should ignore them more, because one of the stories of the past few years is quite how volatile public opinion is. So, for instance, Theresa May was inspired to call a general election partly because of her very healthy lead in the polls. And over the course of her pretty, to be fair, useless election campaign, that lead disintegrated. So while you can feel king of the castle on one month because of the poll numbers, then within a few short weeks, that lead can be obliterated. And I do think there's something slightly dangerous about our kind of sheep-like behavior. Generally, humans like things that are popular. If you're buying something on Amazon and everyone said it's great, you're probably gonna, you're more encouraged to buy it. And I think that probably there is an effect where if you see that Labour have taken a massive lead, you'll probably, if you're not paying very much attention to politics, think, oh, well, they're probably doing a pretty good job. And maybe that Keir Starmer guy isn't quite the same sort of politician as Jeremy Corbyn, who wasn't all that popular, although the polls underestimated his popularity to some extent as well. So yes, I think that we need to treat polls a little bit more carefully than we are at the moment.
I mean, Abdul, you've lived in a lot of different countries, some of which have more transparent elections than others, to put it kindly. What do you think is best practice? Do you think it's useful to know what people are thinking on the basis of polls or not?
Yeah, I come from Syria, and we have polls, and we always expect Assad to win 100%. In the last 3 elections Assad had, he won 99%, 95%, and 92%, while Saddam Hussein won 100%. He's the record holder so far. I think only Gaddafi beats him, and he won 105%, more than the number of the people. But in England, no. I think the polls, whatever you think of the polls, they are just a story made up by journalists. And as you know, journalists can write any story out of nothing. If you look at a lot of headlines, you'll see headlines, for example, what do Americans think of Donald Trump? And it's based on interview with 5 people. Now, that doesn't mean this is all what all Americans believe. And polls are the same thing. If you know who you're going to vote for, it doesn't matter if you read 100 polls or if you read 1,000 polls.
Yeah, but crucially, polls aren't the same thing when they're conducted scientifically by organisations devoted to impartially compiling that data. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? They can get it wrong, but it's not the same thing as a journalist asking 5 people what they think. It's supposed to be a scientific sample of the country.
But at the end of the day, these are called opinion because they don't count. What counts is the vote, the ballot. That's what counts. That's the most thing that counts and make a difference. So as long as it's not the ballot, it doesn't really matter.
It's totally also about the framing. It's like absolutely about the mainstream media and the way that they frame the polls and choosing which polls to use and which not to use. There was quite recently a bit of an uproar because Chris Curtis, who's a pollster, was for YouGov and has now moved on. There was a censorship involved. You'll like this, Olly, because it's bringing back conspiracy theories, but he did say it, that there was a form of censorship involved with a poll around Jeremy Corbyn in a political debate in 2017. And basically, YouGov had to clarify that they had problems with the way the methodology, and that's why the poll didn't run. And Chris Curtis has accepted that as an explanation for why they didn't use the poll. But I think really, if we look at polling as a science, effectively, it's still going to be skewed by which polls the mainstream media choose to focus on, how they choose to frame it. So, I mean, even if we do think, we should get rid of opinion polls or not really trust them, we're still in the kind of, we're still relying on the media for a lot of how we get our framing of an election.
But some people do say not just we shouldn't trust them, Leaf, but that we should get rid of opinion polls because that is something that they do internationally. Not that they don't exist, but that there's a period of time around an election where they're not reported.
That's true. So the Slovak parliament, for instance, voted in 2019 to ban opinion polls 50 days before elections. And there are similar bans in South Korea, which has a ban range of 21 days. And then there are others in Argentina and Greece and Italy and elsewhere. I mean, while I sympathise with the sort of this sort of simplicity of this idea, let's just get rid of polls. I don't really think it's particularly realistic in the British context, because polls are such a kind of core part of the way that we report on politics. And often, you'll see a Sunday paper, if they're a bit short of stories, what they'll tend to do is do a poll about, say, Scottish independence or, where the Labour Party stands. And then that will sort of provide their splash for a Sunday. And so I don't really think...
That's not a reason to keep it. Bleeding hearts for all the Sunday tabloid newspaper editors.
No, but what I mean is that who's going to carry out this ban? Like, it's just not realistic. Like, I think we're all in fairyland if we think that, any time in the next 10 years that there's going to be some sort of concerted, proper, practical effort to eliminate polls. There has been some kind of actually positive movement in the way that the British press reports on things. For instance, when I started out as a journalist, maybe sort of 7 years ago, I think the reporting around suicide was much less responsible. But since then, there have been kind of concerted efforts to, for instance, not mention how people who took their own lives actually did that act. And so there are kind of positive stories that you can tell about the British press becoming more sensitive and responsible.
So how would that look then in this instance then? So being more sensitive and responsible around polls, what could you do?
Maybe putting them in context, saying...
Like what?
So Labour has a 33-point lead, but there's another poll saying that it's actually a 17-point lead, and lots could change before the next election, which after all will probably be not for another couple of years.
And being clear about maybe the bias of the institution that funded it as well, because that's the other thing, isn't it? Like the data can be scientifically done, but the person paying for the survey to be published are looking for a particular result and only publish it if that result is achieved. Very often.
The BBC have great guidelines on it as well. So the BBC Trust, before the 2016 referendum, put out a list of ways in which journalists should use polling in their reporting. And actually, the BBC can't lead a news bulletin, or shouldn't lead a news bulletin, with the results of a poll, and they can't commission their own polling. And that is a good guidelines for how journalists should use them, because it is about saying, actually, all these polls are just suggesting. They're not saying this is exactly how people... Voting intention is really difficult to nail down. And I think if we have guidelines like the BBC Trust have got, but if we have guidelines that... Better regulation of the press, Ollie. That was one of my key drum beats back in the old days. And if there was better regulation of the press, we could see better reporting and better media representation of polls.
Or just better polling, Abdul. I mean, it seems strange, doesn't it, that they are getting it so dramatically wrong when literally that's their only job.
Yeah, that's correct. But again, people are fixated on polls as if polls are 100% accurate. I mean, look at the 1982 California mayoral race between Bradley, a black candidate, and a white candidate. All the polls had expected Bradley to win. At the end of the day, he lost. Another one in Chicago between a black and a white candidate, and all the polls expected the black candidate to win by 14 points. He won by less than 4 points.
Okay, so you're bringing up those instances presumably because you're suggesting there was some latent racism, that when people got to the booths, they actually didn't put their tick in the box of a black man in that instance.
That is in the United States. That's in the United States.
Here we have a similar thing, don't we, Leif, with shy Tories, they call it, don't they? Where basically people say on the phone that they agree, especially if it's policy-based, that they agree with the policies of the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrat. When it comes down to it and they get in the polling booth, they vote Tory anyway, because they always have.
Yeah, there is something especially in that where people, they feel a little bit guilty about how sort of secretly right-wing they are, and how they actually quite agree with, say, some of the things that the more extreme fringes of the Conservative Party are coming out with. But I don't know, I'm a little...
become mainstream now, I suppose, like the Rwanda immigration policy.
Well,
right?
yes, and I'm pretty sceptical about the effect of shy Toryism. It seems that the research around it has been interesting, but like no one can really nail exactly or measure that effect. I think the big issue in polling is really a breakdown of trust in society. We don't pick up the phone anymore. If I got a call from a number that I didn't know, I would be pretty freaked out. I'd be like, oh no, it's a scammer, and I wouldn't pick up the phone. And I think this has really led to a breakdown over the past few years, since sort of the 2000s, of the reliability of polls, and especially their ability to measure the opinions of people who are kind of increasingly at the fringes of society and who don't have trust in other people or in institutions.
So hold on, you mean when YouGov gives someone a call to find out what they think, then the group that you're actually surveying isn't the public, it's the proportion of the public who would talk to someone on the phone?
Yeah, or pick up an email or sign up to be one of YouGov's sort of tracking people. I signed up to answer opinion polls for YouGov so I could make some money on the side, and then I found it boring and annoying. But I'm someone with high institutional trust. But people who aren't paying very much attention to the news and are turned off by it all, they're less likely to get involved in polling.
I mean, Jamie, when you were at the Department for Transport, when you were in Whitehall, to what extent are politicians obsessed with polls? They always say, don't they, when they're asked in the media, oh, there's loads of polls and there's another poll tomorrow and we don't look at polls. But they obviously do.
Yeah, a couple of quick anecdotes. One was that the Conservative Home always do polling of which cabinet minister has the best kind of popularity with Conservative Party members. And Grant Shapps was fairly low down, I'm not going to lie to you. But that was while we were stopping people from going on holiday or organising the French lorry crisis, all of that stuff. And I know that had a massive effect on the way that he communicated, particularly because he was aware of his standing. And then he went on to want to become Tory leader. And another example, also using Mr. Shapps, was that him and Rishi Sunak, not good friends. But at the beginning of the Tory leadership contest, Sunak looked to be the best and most likely to win the contest, and Shapps, when he stood down or realised he couldn't become party leader, backed Sunak because he thought that was the right horse. And it did affect his...
Well, he wasn't in the cabinet because, yes, when Truss became Prime Minister, she didn't want anyone from Sunak's campaign.
So, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and you think that was him following the polls, genuinely?
Genuinely, yeah.
And obviously we should say, Mr. Shapps, if you disagree, please feel free to come on and air your view.
Please write in. Please write in.
Interesting. Okay, Abdul, I'm coming to you next after this. All right, Abdul, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Well, the Home Office tests new English tests.
Introducing the English test designed for you. Convenient, fast, affordable, and trusted by top universities around the world. English testing no longer means paying hundreds of dollars, making appointments, traveling to the test center, and a long, stressful test experience. Now, you can certify your English online, anytime, anywhere in the world, for only $49. All you need is a computer, your ID, and 1 hour alone in a quiet room.
$49. Well, I might as well chuck that English degree of mine in the bin then. The English test designed for you, says that promotional video from the app Duolingo. Abdul, what's the story?
Well, I couldn't love this ad more. The story is that we've learned this week that from a Guardian article that the Home Office is in talks with Duolingo to allow Duolingo English language tests to be accepted by the Visa Center, by the Home Office. For the British people who are listening to this podcast, this might be news to you. People who want to come to the UK, except for immigrants coming through the channels, need to take an English test. And this English test is from what's called Secure English Testing Service or something like this. It costs a lot of money, like the TOEFL, the IELTS, and has a lot of problems. I think we're going to talk about them today. The IELTS, for example, costs anything between 175 and 195 pounds. Now, Duolingo, which is an educational technology company started in 2012, offers a new test. And now this test is acceptable by many universities, including Harvard University, and recognized as the English language test.
So if you're a foreign student and you're applying to study at Harvard, you have to prove your eligibility and your level of English, and they accept Duolingo.
They accept it as, yes, you are the right person, you can speak English, and you're comfortable with that. So if you want to come to the UK to study or to migrate or to become a citizen like me, a good citizen who pays their taxes, you should take this English language test. Fortunately, I did not take this English language test because to become a British citizen, because I studied in the UK. So if you study in the UK, you don't need to take any English language test.
Because common sense would tell any paperwork stamping person that if you're doing a study course, then obviously you can speak English. But then I suppose, doesn't common sense say if you want to prove that you can speak English, the best way is to speak English to an English person? I mean, why do a test at all? Why can't you just talk to an official? I mean, presumably that's how it used to be done.
Well, because talking to an official takes a lot of time. There are thousands and thousands of people applying to come as students. Most of students' visa applications are done through the system, so you only apply documents. Sometimes you get interviewed depending on your nationality, but then the universities need to make sure that they take thousands of students. They cannot afford to interview thousands of students in order to determine who can come and communicate and use English very well.
What do you think are the drawbacks of this, Leaf, if any? I mean, it seems like a positive thing, really, doesn't it, if it's cutting the cost and it's easier and it's reliable?
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't really see that many drawbacks here. Ireland has accepted the test as part of its student visa program, so it's not just universities that are giving it the green light. And it's important to say that this test isn't just like you're sort of prodding at an app on your phone. It's on your computer, and it includes you have to produce some ID, so for instance your passport, and you also speak, and I think there's a webcam element to it as well.
I think it has to film you, doesn't it, so it can prove that you were doing the whole thing.
Yeah. So when initially Abdul suggested this story, I was like, oh god, that sounds really like open to fraud, and perhaps there'll be really clever hackers who can get around this. But it seems to me like quite a safe way of conducting this test. And I think generally British people feel quite strongly that those who are coming over to the UK from abroad should be able to speak the English language. So generally I'm quite pro there being a testing mechanism to ensure that happens, partly to help with integration. And this seems to me like a cheaper and possibly better way of doing things, partly because while we do have these test centres all over the globe, there are lots of countries that don't actually have any. And so, if you want to come to the UK, you have to go to another country to take this test, which is enormously expensive and will stop poorer people potentially from actually wanting to come to the UK.
Yeah, there's some pretty egregious examples of that, Jamie, aren't there, of people travelling abroad to take a test?
Yeah, I mean, I think people were ending up having to spend like thousands of pounds in order to make the move. I just want to pick up slightly on what Leif was saying about integration and the importance of the English language, because I think personally, from my perspective, actually, this all points towards a situation where we lose out on the diversity of languages that's so important. And eventually we end up in a situation where you need to learn either English or Chinese. And actually there's no real cultural diversity because people are just focused on world languages.
But how does that work then? Because why do we lose out on someone's native language? They come over speaking Gujarati or Hindi or, whatever it is, Ukrainian, at the same time as English.
You're insisting that they learn English when actually they could be, learning other languages about their own cultures or around their own. We've basically, as a kind of society in this country, basically said that, in order to study in the UK, you must learn English. And as an example, Albert Einstein wouldn't have passed one of these tests before he had to move to the US.
But he'd have come in as a refugee, wouldn't he, under modern parlance? So that would be different again. Abdul is biting his tongue very kindly. Abdul knows all about this stuff. So what do you think, Abdul, both to what Leif and Jamie have said?
One of the things that I love so much about this test, this Duolingo test, is not the IELTS or not the TOEFL. The IELTS test is an awful test that a lot of people fail. It's very expensive. It's not available everywhere. A lot of students need to travel to other cities or other countries in order to take it. And it takes many hours. And the result comes after 3 weeks. It's kind of used as a gatekeeping, and a lot of people fail. And it's not really secure either.
Yes, but what about this crucial issue about whether it's necessary in the first place? Leif says it is, Jamie says it isn't.
Whether it's necessary, well, if you're going to study in a university and the language is English, and you're going to a country where the name of the country is England, so you need to learn English. If I'm going to China to study in a university, I would learn Chinese, right? So I think it is necessary. But using different tests and different channels is great. Using affordable tests where people don't really have to travel, they can take that from home, is awesome. At the end of the day, learning the language of the country where you live in is awesome for integration.
I don't disagree with that at all. I think the thing is by putting in this barrier and stopping people from entering until they do the test, you're missing out on some like very crucial monolingual people who could be a real benefit, because actually we all know the best way to learn a language is by living in the country itself, and is by, you're not going to be able to from taking a test or a Duolingo or learning in it. It's actually by doing...
I slightly disagree with you. I think before going to Turkey, a lot of people learned Turkish. And then when they came to Turkey, they kind of started resisting. And because like my mother, for example, she only speaks to Syrian people in Turkey because all of her society is Syrians, right? So she would never learn it. While I, for example, I would learn it because I keep going there and traveling there, right? So I would learn it outside of Turkey. And this is the same for English. A lot of people come to England. I know people like, for example, Chinese students, and they would only speak Chinese when they come to England because all their international students are Chinese. They live in the dorms with Chinese students. They only speak English when they come to class. While here in Hong Kong, for example, most of the students want to speak English all the time because they're not in England and they're surrounded by international students.
I mean, this idea of how we learn language, just to sidestep the politics of this, Leaf, is quite interesting as well, isn't it? I don't know if you saw in the article in The Observer in which they released this news that Duolingo is being considered by the UK government, their CEO, Louis von Ahn, was talking about how when they started the app, they approached it as coders and they just thought, we'll give people the most popular words and they'll learn the most popular words as an algorithm. And that's not, as it turns out, as they've evolved this phenomenally successful company, the best way to learn a language.
Yeah, there was an interesting quote from the extremely impressive CEO of this app. Their German course features a big sort of module on asparagus. And I once went out with a German and he was obsessed with asparagus because their asparagus in Germany is white and they have whole festivals celebrating it. And so it seems that you're probably more likely to remember a language and really get involved with its culture if you can kind of see its words in a context. And I mean, I'm not very good at just memorizing a list of words, but if I can remember or read a story pulling me forwards, then I might be a little bit better at the language. So it's been interesting to see sort of Duolingo evolve away from being quite so nerdy and mathsy and towards maybe a slightly more literary and sort of touchy-feely approach to the language.
That's the problem, isn't it? Is that like we've seen that the UK government is changing the rules around GCSEs and basically saying that in order to pass your modern foreign language GCSE, so Spanish, French or German, students are going to have to memorize lists of 1,700 words. And in this interview with the Duolingo CEO, he says that was just an insane way to try and learn a language. You just have to memorize without context.
I have to say briefly, just before we move on, Abdul, you did mention the fictitious example of if you were going to a university in China, you'd learn Chinese. You are teaching at Hong Kong University. Have you learned Chinese?
To a certain extent, yes. But again, I'm not a student. I'm teaching. My job is to teach academic English. So most of the time,
Yeah.
but outside...
Don't avoid my question. How have you learnt Chinese and what's the best way?
So I've been here for 2 years now and all the teaching has been face-to-face, has been online, sorry. Now we're back to face-to-face. And the courses, I've taken 2 courses on Zoom. And just like any other student on Zoom, I really turned off my cam and went to bed and pretended I'm in class. So I massively failed and got A+.
Well, there you are, yeah. A+ for the cultural immersion, at least. You're doing it. Okay, Leif, you're up next after this. All right, Leif, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
An apology from the Queen of Denmark.
On Wednesday, the royal announced the shocking news that she would be stripping the prince, princess, and his and her highness titles from 4 of her grandchildren, 23-year-old Nikolai, 20-year-old Felix, 13-year-old Heinrich, and 10-year-old Athena, who are all children of Prince Joachim. Instead, they will go by His Excellency Count of Montpenzat or Her Excellency Countess of Montpenzat, starting in the new year. However, the children of her first son, Crown Prince Friedrich and Princess Mary, will maintain their royal titles.
A clip from Access Hollywood's YouTube channel, my go-to source for any story concerning the Danish royal family. Leif, recap for us, if we missed it. What's been going on
So this week, the Queen of Denmark, Queen Margrethe II, has apologised after stripping 4 of her grandchildren of their royal titles. So they were called, princes and princesses, and his or her Royal Highness. But now they have been sort of downgraded, and they'll just be sort of counts and countesses. And so this decision by the Queen has caused shockwaves through Denmark, but also within the actual family. And Prince Nikolai, who's one of the grandchildren who's been stripped of his title by his grandmother, said that he was very sad to have lost the title.
Which is unusual when it comes to royal protocol, isn't it? You know, if any institution has a long time to make evolutionary decisions, it's usually the monarchy. Why do you think this has sprung up and surprised her?
I think that these conversations have been happening for a while. Margaret was, I think, thinking about changing their titles, these children's titles, when they turned 25. And I think that royal families, the one in the UK included, they really take seriously their own survival. And if they think that, if there are loads and loads of princes and princesses going around and not really working towards the public good, the people who actually are at the top of them might start worrying that public faith in the institution will fail. So it seems that the Queen Margrethe has come to the conclusion that actually, in order to save, the body, she has to cut off a limb.
Yeah, and the logic of that sort of seems sound, Jamie, regardless of what your views are on the monarchy if you're Danish. I guess the point is, it's clear that the direction of travel is a slimmed-down monarchy in every royal family. So it makes sense to not have titles in the future for large numbers of the family. But this way of doing it, telling someone who is a prince or a princess, and they're a child, mind you, sorry, mate, you're not a prince anymore, just felt a bit harsh. Why not wait until their children can't be princes or princesses?
Yeah, it's not a good Disney film, is it? You don't want to be hearing them the other way, getting taken away.
The former Princess and the Frog.
Yes, exactly. The artist formerly known as Prince. Cards on the table, and long-term listeners will know I'm not a big fan of the monarchy. I did struggle when the Crown Prince Frederick asked what will they write in their passports now, as if that was the big worry that we were all on the edge of our seats for. What I do think is interesting, to answer your question, Ollie. There is obviously a public opinion about funding and about the amount of money that goes into these people. And
you've been looking at polls now, have you?
Well.
Suddenly, polls have a purpose.
I never said that we should ban polling. I just brought it to the table. Interesting. And the public funding for the royal family in Denmark is linked to the pay index of Denmark's state sector employees. Now, do you think, Ollie, am I pro or against that? What do you think? I'm for it.
Why?
I think basically because we need to have in the UK, because obviously that's where this conversation is probably heading. In the UK, the overall spending, it looks like, is going to be £102 million in a year for the monarchy, and that's mainly to do with renovations and things like that. So I do think if we're going to pay this amount of public money for the royal family, we probably should also pay our state sector employees a similar amount.
I mean, in as much as you'd expect moves like this within the first few weeks of King Charles's reign, Abdul, he does seem to be slightly ahead of this story in that he's indicated, hasn't he, that he wants a slimmed-down monarchy.
He wants a slimmed-down monarchy. That's great, but it starts with him, right? It starts with the head. You don't like half-baked pies, and you don't like half measures, right? So you gotta take it all the way in. You can't just say, okay, I'm the queen now. I'm gonna strip some of my children from their titles that nobody really knows about, because this is better for the future of the monarchy. Well, better for the future. Why don't you start by stripping your own titles and giving them back? And
that's not exactly better for the future of the monarchy. That means ending the monarchy.
Well, the queen said in the defense of her decision that she is doing this so the children can focus on their future, and they are relieved from the responsibility of doing these duties, that as if nobody wants to do these duties. Now, I know who wants to travel to other countries and be hosted in the best hotels and meeting the most spectacular people. Nobody wants that, right? It's like a burden on someone's shoulders. So the queen thinks that this is something really difficult. So if this is something really difficult and this is something really taxing on the mental and physical health of people, then it should start with the head.
Leif, what has the reaction to this been in Denmark?
Well, I've been speaking to my friend who's Danish, and she's been talking to all.
I've been speaking to the Leif Arbuthnot Danish correspondent.
Yes, here I am. I had dinner with her last night, and all of her Danish friends are actually, there's apparently real shock in the country at this decision. And it's worth saying that Queen Margaret II has really rock solid poll ratings. Not that we're interested. She's loved, and also the monarchy in Denmark is really popular. This is one of the things that I find quite interesting about this story, because it's a reminder of the fact that you can live in a very equal country like Denmark is by sort of international standards, and yet people are still quite into this monarchy, which, it's also worth adding, is, as far as I can tell, fairly less wealthy than the British monarchy. And, you know, this index that Jamie was talking about probably has some role to play there. So people in Denmark are pretty shocked. There are also people who think that it's, well, fair enough, partly because the children are extremely privileged already, and they should probably be able to make their way through life just going by Count and Countess. That seems plenty.
I mean, there is a communications angle to this, isn't there, Jamie? Because, I mean, it seems implausible to me that the son of the Queen didn't know she was about to make this change. I mean, maybe he didn't, but discussions have obviously been going on for, you'd imagine, decades. So it's an error that he was able to express his children's feelings to the press at all. Like, if they'd come out with a universal presentation of this is how it's going to be from now on, there'd be much less debate about it.
Yeah. As a former government comms person, I can tell you that's bad communication. I do wonder whether or not Crown Prince Joachim's going to end up on Oprah, though, quite like how Harry and Meghan did. I would say, though, because in Whitehall I did learn a bit of balance, that slimming down the monarchy does have some negative side effects for some in when it comes to charities. I know that Princess Anne does about 200 engagements a year. William and Kate end up only doing 150 between them. I'm not saying anything, but that's a bit of a difference considering there's two of them. But obviously, if you're a patron of a charity and you're a royal patron, you know, if there are fewer people in the monarchy, that means there's fewer charities that get patronized. That means inevitably there's less attention on these charities. That inevitably means that they're going to get less funding. So I mean, I'm as shocked as you are, Ollie, that I've come out in support of potentially not slimming down the monarchy. But there are, you know, there's balance. There's pros and cons.
Well, to go back to your argument about being a count could do it just as well, though, Leif. I mean, you know, can't a count or a countess be the patron of a charity without a title that's higher than that?
I think so, but, you know, nothing quite like prince or princess. Like, prince and princesses make up all of our fairy tales. You don't get all that many. I mean, you do get some about a handsome count, but they're vanishingly fewer than there are stories about princes and princesses. I just hope that these children don't kind of imbibe this as a mortal wound and then make a great failure of their lives. They've clearly got everything going for them. So I just hope that they can recover from this horrible wound and give back to Denmark.
Well, on that, Princess Leif and Prince Abdul and Jamie, we're going to leave it. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. In the meantime, I've been Prince Olly Mann. Our music is by Prince Tom Morby, the producer Princess Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week,